So Clue is a movie from 1985 that up until recently I had never seen. And it wasn't because I had a lack of interest in it or anything like that, it just slipped through the cracks. I can't speak for whatever reason. It was just one that I'd never seen before. And after seeing it, now I'm even less enthused about it than I was before. This was a movie that I have a lot of mixed feelings about. There is a lot to enjoy about it. I think that the characters and most of the performances here are pretty fun. The characters are actually really well defined and given specific roles and traits, and they embody them pretty well. Mrs. Peacock is like a madam, and she has this really flamboyant, seductive personality. You've got Tim Curry, who is Wadsworth the butler, who delivers a perfectly Alfred from Batman-esque performance. Christopher Lloyd is a doctor man who is a doctor man, and everyone else has pretty defining traits that make them instantly recognizable, and it helps that everyone's clothing and costumes are completely different from each individual character, and since they're so well defined, their costumes actually fit the character pretty well too. So that stuff I liked. I liked all that stuff, and I think Tim Curry is actually fantastic in this movie. I've never thought of him as a great actor per se, but a great performer. Every movie he's in, he is just delivering great performances. He's never like the most natural actor like a Daniel Day-Lewis. He usually is just performing. And when you get him in the right role, he can really steal the show, and that is the case with this movie. He has so many monologues in here where he's just like rambling on and on, but he's transfixing while he's doing it, especially near the end when you get this incredibly elongated sequence where he's like running in between the rooms of this house explaining the events of the movie.
At the start of the evening, Yvette was here by herself, waiting to offer you all a glass of champagne. I was in the hall. I know because I was there.
But that brings me to my first and major negative of this movie, the comedy. I don't think it's that funny. And that's not to say that they don't try to be funny or that there is a lack of jokes. I think the jokes actually fly really quickly here. The problem for me is that it feels just like a Zucker Brothers movie. It actually feels like it's ripping off the Zucker Brothers formula of comedy, which is a good formula to rip off because they are hilarious. I mean, Airplane is one of my favorite comedies of all time. Top Secret is one of my favorite comedies of all time. And The Naked Gun is one of my favorite comedies of all time. And even though their show Police Squad, didn't go for very long, only 6 episodes, it's legitimately fantastic, and it recently came out on Blu-ray, which I picked up and would highly recommend picking up. It is amazing, even though it's only 6 episodes. But Clue actually reminded me a lot of Police Squad in the way it was executed, in the way that it was blocked and framed, the jokes, the dry, sarcastic humor, and the very literal dialogue. It is so Zucker Brothers to me that I just couldn't help but think, I'd just rather watch a Zucker Brothers movie at this point.
Is this the right address to meet Mr. Body?
Oh, you must be Mr. Green.
Yeah.
Sit! No, not you, sir.
Stewardess, I think the man sitting next to me is a doctor.
Sir, excuse me, sir. I'm sorry I have to wake you. You a doctor?
That's right.
We have some passengers that are very sick. Could you come take a look at them?
And that stuff I liked in this movie. That stuff I think is the best parts of this movie, like when Tim Curry says, "I'm gonna expose the killer," and it hard cuts to the staff sergeant colonel guy, and he goes, "There are women present." Little jokes like that I think are pretty funny. But for the most part, the biggest issue I have with the humor is that the comedic timing is just wrong. It's just off in all the wrong ways. There are so many moments where I was like, was that the joke? I felt like it was supposed to keep going or something else was supposed to happen to make it a joke, but it kind of never did. There's a moment where a character goes and sits on a table and I instantly thought it's gonna collapse, and it doesn't. And then it cuts to Tim Curry monologuing, and about halfway through the monologue, then the table collapses. And I was like, the comedic timing is just all wrong. It doesn't quite work. And then there's a moment where they show people's feet running in between rooms at the very end of the movie, which I already talked about when Tim Curry is delivering this huge monologue. And I just instantly thought of the Zucker brothers because it's just shot of people's feet running to the next room. And I went, oh, there could have been a great gag there. You could have all these people's feet running to one side and then maybe like a chicken's feet running behind them, or somebody that's just like soaking wet, or like anything, just like something bizarre and random to follow them, or have them run in one direction and then instantly come back a direction and then start dancing. Like I've seen that in a Zucker Brothers movie, but they just didn't here. It feels like the comedy has a real lack of creativity to it. Some of the jokes I think are funny because they're very literal, but a lot of it is either slapsticky or just kind of lowbrow. A lot of the jokes are really lowbrow and lack a real vision to them. It does feel like they are just ripping off the Zucker brothers without the charm or creativity of the Zucker brothers.
Oh my God. She's going to faint. Sorry, catch her. I'll catch you. Fall into my arms. Sorry.
Another issue that rears its head really early on is the editing. I think the editing is atrocious in this movie. The first thing you see is a poorly edited sequence of Tim Curry throwing bones to dogs, and it's so awkwardly executed you can't tell what's going on at any moment during this scene. And there are so many other scenes like this where it's like they cut to something and then they cut to something else and then something awkward happens and then it cuts away and you have no idea what happened or why it happened. It's just so awkward. And this kind of affects the story as a whole. I think the story is fine, but there are moments throughout this story where I felt like you could just rip out the moment and nothing would change, or you could pull the moment from one point in the story and put it in another, and it wouldn't feel any different.
I killed Yvette. I hated her so much. It flames on the side of my face.
The story itself is pretty simple. It's about just this group of people congregating in a house after they receive a mysterious letter. And then a host comes in and they find out that the host is actually blackmailing all of them in one way or another. And then the host gives all of them the weapons from the Clue board game and says, we can kill Wadsworth the butler and no one will know that any of this happened and we can all go about our merry way. Or you can turn me into the police and I'll give you all up and you'll all be in the headlines of the newspaper. And he turns off the lights and then gets killed. And so from there, which is like 20 minutes in roughly, it's basically a murder mystery. Who did it? Who killed this Mr. Body, which is a stupid name. They couldn't think of anything better. And from here, the movie takes a drastic nosedive in terms of entertainment value, in terms of structure, and in terms of editing, really. I already mentioned the editing, but there are so many plot points after this that come either at the wrong place in a structure or just out of nowhere. There's a moment later on in the movie when the killer turns the power off in the whole house and they go and kill 3 people. They go and kill this police officer that wandered into the house. They kill this guy whose car broke down in front of the house. And then they kill this singing telegram person. And all 3 of these characters feel disposable and unnecessary. There's a cook that gets killed. There's a maid that gets killed. There is a guy whose car breaks down in front of the house that gets killed. A cop that gets killed. And then a singing telegram person that gets killed. And in an airplane type of movie where you have these weird characters that come out of nowhere and just like die, that's the last you hear of them. Like in Airplane, our main character is telling his stories about his stewardess girlfriend leaving him to various people on the plane, and they kill themselves, and that's the last you hear of them. And it's funny because it's a one-off gag. The problem is here, when somebody dies here, they have to stay there because it's part of the murder mystery. So it ends up just feeling like they're introducing characters just to die, which is weird because only horror movies do that. But apparently Clue also does this. It's so bizarre. And all of these characters show up They die, and that's all that their significance is to the story, just to die. Like the singing telegram person literally comes out of nowhere, gets shot, and is dead. That's it. That's all that that character amounts to. The police officer that comes into the house, checks the house out, and then gets killed, and that's all that that character amounts to.
Is... in the dark.
But the ending, or the endings, I should say, is my least favorite part of this movie. I actually hate this. I legitimately strongly dislike the fact that this movie has 3 different endings, which apparently all went to different theaters. You couldn't see this movie with all 3 of the endings after one another like you can now, which is how I watched it on Amazon Prime. And that's the worst part, honestly. If I just saw this movie with one ending, I think I would have been a little bit happier with this movie, even though the plot is stupid and kind of poorly structured. But no. In this case, there are 3 endings, and they all play back to back to back, and it makes it feel like really nothing matters. You get the first ending where it's revealed that Mrs. Peacock is the killer, and there's all this expository dialogue explaining why she did it, because there is actually no reason why she would have done that in the first place, any of it. And then the second ending, it's Mrs. Peacock who's the killer, and then there's a ton of expository dialogue explaining why she would have done it, because it's not explained in the first place. And then the third ending is that all of them had a hand in it, and there's tons of expository dialogue explaining why, because it's not set up in the first place. The major plot points and features of the characters that we learn is that they're all from Washington, D.C. Oh, and they're all government employed. Oh, and that's it. Then later in the movie, it's revealed that Mrs. Peacock's apparently had the cook that was killed in this movie as her cook, but that's never established or set up.
Good shot.
It just doesn't make any sense. And it's revealed later in the movie, and they have to explain it all in thorough detail because they don't set it up. It's bizarre and baffling. And the fact that they have 3 different endings just proves to me that they had absolutely no confidence in this story, because they have 3 different endings to be like, we just have to have a gimmick. Just throw a gimmick on top of the movie, send it into theaters, and maybe people will go and try to find all 3 endings at different theaters and we'll get a bunch of money. Because the story sucks and isn't interesting at all.
Where is it?
What, the body?
The phone. What body?
But there's no body. Nobody. There's nobody in the study. No.
No.
But I think there's a phone in the lounge.
Thank you.
So yeah, that's sort of my thoughts on Clue. It's a movie that is plagued with issues and little things that I strongly dislike, but there are things that are legitimately good about it. I think that if you're gonna rip off any style of comedy, it should be the Zucker brothers. I think Tim Curry is very good in this. I think the characters are pretty well defined in a way that works for this movie. And there are some gags that are legitimately hilarious. I do like when you have very dry and sarcastic humor, and this movie abounds with it, even though half of it doesn't land. So, in the end, it's a movie that I would just say skip and watch Police Squad instead, because it has a lot more inspired gags, it has a lot more inspired humor, and the stories are actually somehow more interesting.